Darklings. So today I'm going to talk about splatter, gore, torture porn films. So apparently some people have not heard the term torture porn, which is a very particular type of movie that has more shock value than plot and became very, very popular, and this is sort of the abbreviated history. So it kind of traces back to the 1960s, courtesy of Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood Feast from 1964 and his subsequent gory, ridiculous, over-the-top endeavors such as Blood Feast 2, Wizard of Gore, Gore Girls, 2000 Maniacs, all of this stuff. And he would always make very outlandishly violent films. Into the 70s, you have the boom of the exploitation film that usually involves gang activity, murder, rip and revenge films, and then pushing into the 80s, cannibalism films. There was a big boom of cannibalism for shock value that got banned in a lot of countries throughout the 1980s. And then this is really moving on into the 2000s, where it was kind of at its height. And I noticed with 2000 horror films, there are a couple of big draws for the box office. There's the ghost story, most of which are remade from Japanese films, which I'm not going to talk about today. And then there are the gore films, of which there are two main kinds. There are the original content, and there are the remakes of 1970s exploitation films. So it kind of really, there was nothing quite like a violent film out of France or Australia, I've noticed. So big hitters such as High Tension, if I drop everything, Inside, and Martyrs, they kind of set the blueprint for how to achieve an unbelievable level of violence. These films are very, very gruesome, very difficult to watch, in addition to exploitation films such as The Loved Ones, that are also, you are watching prolonged torture scenes, and you can't really figure out why. But in the US, you had, for example, from Eli Roth, you had the Hostel films and Cabin Fever. From James Wan and Darren Lynn Bousman, you have the Saw films. From Neil Marshall, you have The Descent and Dog Soldiers. I cannot remember who directed this film. David Slade did 30 Days of Night, which is actually based off of a comic. And then from Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, you ended up with the Grindhouse films. So there's a Splat Pack, as named by Alan Jones and Total Film Magazine in the mid-2000s, and that includes Alexander Aja, that includes Darren Lynn Bousman, Neil Marshall, Greg McLean, James Wan, Lee Watsonell, and Rob Zombie. And that's just sort of like the big lump of people that are responsible for the gore boom. In addition to all of these original films, you also have Rob Zombie's endeavors that makes very direct homage to 70s films, as well as his remakes of Halloween, and then the remake of House of Wax. And on top of that, you also have the gritty, gorier, bigger remakes of The Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Funny Games, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is still going, and I've seen several of those films, but not all of them. And I kind of wonder at why in the 2000s there was such an extreme fixation on doing splatter movies. And I think part of it has to do with reaction to the violence of the war on terror and the whole thing in the Middle East. I think that might be a part of it, but that's mostly speculation I can't have a total input on. But we also had greater computer usage. And even if it looks fakey now, 10 years later, in the mid-2000s, a lot of these computer effects combined with practical effects look significantly more believable than they ever had before. That even stretches back into the 90s, but 90s features weren't quite as gory as they are now. They were still focusing on their meta-horror and their ghost stories and their psychological thrillers more than these gory films. And I have mixed feelings on the gore films. On the one hand, sometimes it can be very viscerally gratifying to see something this violent and kind of exercise the fear of having that kind of torture put onto you. And then other times it's just sort of like, this is just an exercise in who you can make throw up first. For example, a very, very infamous film that I haven't seen and don't have interest in seeing, not because I don't think I can stomach it, but just because it just sounds miserable, is a Serbian film. I've had plenty of people ask if I've seen it, and I just don't want to because it just sounds awful. It sounds cringy and terrible. A couple of very distinct films that I can think of that deal with video nasties and video violence and then people's psychological reaction to it include Videodrome and Thesis, which I didn't bring over here and should have. And that has to deal with people reacting to violent crimes, real violent crimes on video. And it's kind of interesting to see why we have such a fascination in all of this. And I know some people have like deep down sadistic tendencies and they can kind of exercise it through the films. And then other people, it's just glutton for punishment type of things. And being scared is a catharsis, as I usually view it. And even if I don't find these films scary, there's some times where I'm just like, ew, I'm glad that's not happening to me. But overall, it's just kind of odd that we keep putting up with this type of misery. Just some food for thought. And if you like violent films, those are basically my suggestions because this is the highlight of the 2000s genre. As for the remakes, I do recommend looking into the originals. I haven't seen the remake of Funny Games, but I haven't seen the remake of Last House on the Left because Last House on the Left was one of those movies I watched once and was like, never again. And I Spit on Your Grave is another one that got remade, and I hate the original so much I didn't know why they remade it. So, all food for thought. Till next time, darklings.